Hello and welcome. We are doing Mass Communication 335, and today we have a first chapter of Module 2, which is Introduction to Print Media. I'm Dr. Dawood Waeed, and hopefully, in the course of this session, you'll learn something interesting. Now, if you look at mass communication, it is very, very simple. The modules are basically first introduction, then there's print media, then there's oral radio media, then there's television, advertisement, and the new media we talk about. Just simple modules. If you understand the modules, it's very easy to understand the whole concept. Now, print media is anytime you pick up a newspaper, there is a political news, a sports news, news about local, national, international, all of it is covered in a print media concept. In fact, anything from a movie ticket to the newspapers that you see, the magazines that you see is print media. Now, this particular chapter has lots of explanation and names and all. So if you want to understand print media, you probably have to look at lots of simple concepts and names. Now, in our last session also we spoke about, so remember, I'm not very good at drawing, but this is a leaf. So the first time print started when people were writing on a palm leaf. Sometimes images stay in your mind. Then as the human race evolved, as people started inventing things, there was a discovery of papyrus, the leaves that Chinese invented when the first people to invent the art of printing. So papyrus is a plant that using papyrus started making it, and they started doing it with wood block. So printed wood block, which was actually as recently as in the 19th century, it was used. Even now, it is displayed in the Japan's calligraphy museum. So the wood block came in. Then the first book was called the Diamond Sutra, right, by Wong Chick. Yeah, it looks some very interesting conversations and names here. But very importantly, for you to understand printing, remember these names. So one of the most important name is Johannes Gutenberg of Germany, who invented the printing press. And once you invent the printing press, you also realize that we were talking about a very interesting. The first thing that was printed on this German printing press by this was the Bible in the Latin language. And that's an interesting concept. A lot of 1,000 pages. So there's a lot of printing happening in the first part itself of the early 19th century. Now, quickly, when we look at printing, these are in-text questions, very interesting. Who invented the art of printing? That is the Chinese. Where and where the first paper mill started. Now, we know about the paper mill part of it. In India, where the paper mill was there, it was in Old Goa, Portuguese industry in Old Goa. That is where we were looking into it. And you can also look at the industry's first and foremost invention was the Chinese through the wood block. What are the interesting newspapers named? Just randomly, you don't have to even think of it. Most common and most popular newspaper is TOI, Times of India. You can also look at the Indian Express. You can look at the Hindu. You can look at the Statesman. So these are the common newspapers that we can think of. What are the three most important things of a newspaper? Remember, IEE, information, education, and entertainment. So your Bombay Times is entertainment. All the news that you read is information. And of course, you educate yourself through the means and the chapters that we talk about. Now, in terms of understanding the first newspaper, so these are some quick questions we can get. Remember, Chinese were the first people. So the first newspaper was published in China, and Beijing is the capital of China. The old name of Beijing was Peking. So this is called the Peking Gazette. What are the newspapers as they became more popular? They started being circulated. East India Company came to India. All of these stories that we know of. And remember two important things. In United States, the newspaper is called public occurrence. They're coming in public. And UK, it's called the daily paper. Again, this chapter has lots of names. Thode names of yaad kar lo, simple examples you remember, you'll be able to understand a lot of it in terms of it. What about India? And I'm skipping a lot of things so that you don't have to remember everything. But in India, the biggest city associated with newspaper and print industry is Kolkata. Kolkata is first in many things, the first metro station, the first railway company. It was the capital of East India Company, first Supreme Court, first post office, first telegraph office, a lot of things in Kolkata, right? So why not the first newspaper? So there was a Nobel Prize winner in Kolkata. So the first newspaper was started by a Britisher, James Hickory, of course, as the capital of Kolkata. The state is West Bengal, so it's Bengal Gazette. Bengal Gazette was a wonderful newspaper, only 2 pages, but East India Company did not like it. Now, this was an independent Britisher writing, criticizing the policies of the Britishers, so it was soon stopped. However, that led to the starting of the newspaper industry in India, and a lot of new names you'll see. So remember James Hickory and Bengal Gazette, but then soon we had the Indian Gazette, we had the Kolkata Gazette, and then the Bengal Journal. All of this in the early 18th century, which is 1780 and 1785. Now, because these newspapers are coming in, there was also Madras Courier, Madras Gazette, started, of course, from Madras. Now, is Mumbai behind? So, Mumbai Herald started. So, remember, Kolkata, Madras, and Mumbai. So, these are the newspapers that we had. Now, very interestingly, the first language newspaper was in Kannada, and it was called Kannada Samachar. So many names, make a note of it. But importantly, a question that usually comes is, what are the newspapers that are started by Gandhiji? So, Gandhiji started a newspaper. Of course, now that will go to Gujarat and Gujarati. And the oldest publication in India is a Gujarati daily called the Mumbai Samachar. Not only in Asia, India, but Asia also. So this is something you remember. And as we all know, so many interesting concepts and conversations will start. Since we are talking about Gandhiji, let me quickly go down. Gandhiji started two very important newspapers. One is called the Harijan, which of course, as it is called for the people who were considered untouchable. He wanted to bring that, and he insisted, Gandhiji, that Harijan will have no advertisement. So it is all about generosity of people who would buy it. And then there was a Gujarati newspaper called Navjivan. I don't know how many for Navratri and Rangoli. These are Navjivan. A New Life is the newspaper in Gujarati. So primarily, a newspaper can be divided into the way it is spread out. So just to quickly go to it, there are three ways you can talk about newspaper. One is if it's every day. So it is daily. Then there's weekly. Then there's fortnightly, and there's monthly. Right? Remember, so daily are all the newspapers, Times of India, Statesman, everything around it. Then we've got a newspaper which is weekly, right? And then we've got a newspaper which is fortnightly, every alternate, 15 days. So you have newspapers like Champak magazine. There's so many magazines that are into those lines. So I'll quickly give you an example of these newspapers. Weekly is, for example, there is Times of India, that is daily. So India Today is weekly, and week. Example, remember the week. Then monthly is Reader's Digest. You have got Malayalam Manorama, which is continued sometime annually also, but Reader's Digest is very famous. Then there is the Filmfare, some of the most magazine, Outlook magazine. These are very common. There is fortnightly, like Tinkle, Champak, most of the kids magazine in today's time, Amar Chitrakatha, all of these are on a fortnightly basis. Too many numbers and remembering things. So this is how Navjivan Times there. It's interesting. When modern technology came, newspapers became easier and easier to print. Now, one of the more important things is typeface came in. Black and white was replaced by colors. And now, one of the things that you see today is also in shots, like the online newspapers. So the online newspapers, all the current newspapers have online version. Times of India, The Hindu, Statesman, Indian Express. So you can just use these as an example. Now, the most important thing, if you have to remember, is they are tabloids. What's a tabloid? Tabloid is basically half the size of a newspaper, but it is usually evening newspapers are tabloid. For example, in India, one of the most common ones are called Midday and Metro. So Midday and Metro are tabloids that we see. We are looking at some of these are very, very popular newspapers. Internet has changed a lot of things. Just remember, conversation you need to understand is newspapers can be divided according to their sizes. So broadsheet, all large newspapers are broadsheet. We also said about tabloids, half the size of newspaper. Evening newspapers, Midday is a very common example. Sun is a very common example of tabloid. There is another one called Berliner. What's a Berliner? Berliner basically is the shortest form. The smallest of newspaper is the Berliner. So if I can just take you across what a Berliner would mean, and you'll understand. Small newspapers, pocket size, So remember, a Berliner could be, or middies. They're called middies. They're mostly popular in Europe. And Mint is a very, very popular example of a Berliner. Remember, broadsheet, tabloids, and Berliner. The last thing is an example of what's the difference between the two things. Print media and electronic media, a very short question. Most of us look at it and we look at this and we say, okay, what is the common thing? Now, for print media, you must be literate. So reading is a very essential part of print media. But electronic media, an illiterate person can also hear, and this becomes a part of the thinking. So print media literacy, electronic media, no reading skills required. Print media works on a deadline. Newspapers cannot be printed late. There is a printing, there's a delivery. There is no deadline in a electronic media. It is so with the same thing, you can go remote, even minute to minute update is possible. Immediate update is not possible. The same way you can write it down. Language in a print media is more literary, more grammatical, more flowery. It has to, punctuation marks, spelling mistakes will be taken care very, seriously. But in the oral media, in the electronic media, language is very, very user friendly. You don't need to do that. It is a very, very simpler, less formal medium. Print media usually is very permanent. That is, in a court of law, print media is more popular. You can't use a website, but a printed document is more important. But print media also gives you scope in that positive thing, in-depth scope. You can write stories and articles and all, but an electronic media has very less article. This, in summary, is an introduction to the print world, a very interesting chapter. Our next chapter is what is news, and hopefully we'll take a newspaper and decode it. Until then, good luck, study well.